School for Whatnots, Chapter 40. Max and Nurse Beverly and Lola in a panic. No one else should be here now, Lola said. I'll check the security footage to see. Oh! She snapped the lid of the laptop down before Max could see what was going on. But her face went pale and bloodless around the gaping holes in her skin. Or, well, she looked bloodless now in the way a terrified human might, rather than the way an android was always bloodless. We'll have to hide, Nurse Beverly said. Quick! She darted toward the door out in the hall, but Max could tell. The footsteps outside were coming toward the principal's office now. Here! Lola gasped, running toward a door Max had never much paid attention to. He'd never seen it open before. Lola had to punch in a code just to unlock it. But she whipped the door open and shoved Max and Nurse Beverly inside the tiny room, cramming herself in as well. The room, or closet, contained deflated playground balls and old textbooks and empty hangers. Max had to tilt his head to one side to avoid rattling the hangers against the rod. He had to stand still to avoid accidentally knocking any of the playground balls and having them thud against the door or wall. But Lola had shut the door and latched before Max heard the main door to the office creak open. Nobody screamed out, "Who's hiding in the closet?" So he guessed they were all right. That is, as long as nobody outside the closet could hear the frantic beating of his heart, which seemed to get louder and louder by the minute. Over the racket, Max heard footsteps entering the office. Through a crack under the closet door, he saw a sudden flash. Someone had apparently turned on the office's bright overhead light. Yes, we do have to talk with you, a woman's voice insisted. It's essential. And unless you want us to file a lawsuit against your corporate malpractice, you'll listen. This was a man speaking. Max was so disoriented and his heart was beating so loudly. And maybe there was something odd and distorting about the thickness of the walls in the closet. So it took him a moment to realize he knew exactly who had just arrived at the school. It was Mom and Dad. A third voice answered, airy and careless. Yes, and I could just easily file a lawsuit against you for stalking me here. I'm certain you would not appreciate the publicity. This was the mystery woman from the night before, wasn't it? Nurse Beverly laid her hand on Max's shoulder. Did she think he'd do something foolish, like run out sobbing to Mom and Dad? It really was hard to resist the urge to run out sobbing to Mom and Dad. Look, we've clearly gotten this conversation off on the wrong start. Dad sounded friendlier now, as if he wanted the mystery woman to like him. This was the voice he used when he took calls from all around the world, assuring counterparts from Mumbai or London, Cairo or Seoul, that his latest business idea would be good for them all. My wife and I have a proposition for you. I've spent the morning looking into your company's financials and I've noticed certain irregularities. The Whatnot Corporation is in trouble. So, we have a solution that will allow us to give our son what he wants, and it will solve your problems too. We'll buy your company, and then Max will be able to see Josie again. Max's heart almost exploded with love. Of course, Mom and Dad had figured out a solution. Of course, everything would work out. Everything in his life always did. Why had he even doubted it? He put his hand on the doorknob, ready to jump out and scream, Thanks, Mom and Dad! But Nurse Beverly's hand on his shoulder held him back. Lola yanked him back from the doorknob, too. And out in the principal's office, the mystery woman replied, No, the Whatnot Corporation is not for sale. It cannot be sold. We would pay extra, Mom interrupted, her voice just as steely as the other woman's. We would make it completely worth your while. That doesn't matter, the mystery woman said. You cannot buy the Whatnot Corporation for any price. She paused as if drawing out the pleasure of turning them down. There is absolutely nothing you can do to allow your son to ever see Josie again. Chapter 40. Meanwhile, a few moments earlier with Josie and Ivy. We might have to break a window to get in, Josie said as she and Ivy rounded the last corner before the school. Yeah, I figured, Ivy said with a gulp. But if we're caught, I know how to turn off the alarm system, Josie bragged. From running around the school at night, we won't get caught. Ivy's fingers threaded together, twisting her hands back and forth nervously. Josie could tell Ivy didn't like the thought of breaking anything. Ivy liked creating things. Josie and Ivy crouched down beside the wall around the schoolyard. Together, They peeked around the corner of the wall in case a security guard happened to be patrolling the front of the building. Josie could hardly believe her eyes. The front door was open, just at the point of starting to swing shut. If we hurry, never mind, she whispered, realizing there wasn't time to explain. She hurdled the low wall and took off running. She was glad she was wearing sneakers, so her footfalls were nearly silent. She was glad she'd had 6 years of practice creeping around the school. She did wish it wasn't such bright sunshine outdoors, though. She reached the door just as it was about to settle into place. She kicked her leg out and wedged the toe of her shoe between the door and the frame at the last minute. Success! Her toes hurt, but she kept the door from shutting and locking. Next, she slid down, almost flattening herself to the ground. That way she'd be less noticeable if whoever had opened the door in the first place looked back. She pulled the door open a little wider and peeked in through the cracks. 3 dark figures were walking down the front hallway of the school away from the door. They were moving so briskly that Josie stopped worrying that anyone could look back. She turned and waved to Ivy, who was still crouched down by the wall, inching forward. That was so smooth, Ivy hissed as soon as she reached Josie. I wish I had a phone just so I could have gotten that move on video. I could reenact it once we both have phones again, Josie offered in a whisper. She'd forgotten for an instant that she and Ivy probably wouldn't be hanging out together at all after today. They probably wouldn't even be at the same school. Anyhow, let's go find out how to track down our classmates. Let's go find out all the things Lucinda couldn't tell us, so we can tell our friends the truth, including Max. Josie was holding the door open with her fingers now instead of her toes. She cracked it a little wider. The 3 figures ahead of them had vanished. I think we're safe to go in, Josie whispered. The keypad to turn off the alarm is in the principal's office. We should hit that first, just in case. I bet some of the answers we want are in the principal's office, too, Ivy said. Doesn't she have files of everyone's information? Good idea, Josie said. Both girls slipped through the front door and began tiptoeing down the hallway. Josie kept looking around for places to dart into and hide if the 3 people who opened the door came back. She thought they were probably custodians planning the summer renovations. Another class of whatnots were bound to be starting this fall, probably kindergartners, who'd have different needs than Josie and Max's class had had as 5th graders. Josie didn't want to think about the fall. She reached the door to the principal's office and silently wrapped her hand around the doorknob. Then she heard voices coming from inside. They were saying something about lawsuits, something about corporations, something about a proposition. Ivy grabbed Josie's arm, yanking her back from the door. Ivy mouthed the word at Josie, but her face looked as distressed as if she were screaming. Josie leaned close to Ivy's ear. No, I have to hear what's going on. That's Max's mom and dad. Weren't they supposed to be on vacation already with Max? Was Max inside the principal's office too? Ivy frowned and shook her head disapprovingly, but she didn't keep tugging Josie toward the exit, just back closer to the wall. Then Josie heard an unfamiliar voice speak loud and clear. There is absolutely nothing you can do to allow your son ever to see Josie again. Josie didn't think. She didn't plan. She just felt. She felt the weight of 6 years of lying to her best friend, and for that matter to Ivy too. She felt the 6 years of going to bed every night in a lonely basement room under what really did look like a crypt, far across the city from her beloved father. She felt the weight of never quite belonging, of never truly owning any of the books she read, the cell phone that she used for texting, the tablet she used for homework, or even her bedside lamp. She felt the weight of everything that had been taken away from her, and she didn't think for a moment about what else she could still lose. In one quick movement, Josie stepped forward and yanked open the door of the principal's office. Max's parents and a woman wearing a dark veil jerked their heads around toward her. You don't get to speak for me! Josie screamed. Max and me! We'll make our own decisions! Chapter 42. The narrator's aside. Oh, Josie! Oh no! All the sacrifices you've made, were they for nothing? All the sacrifices you made for yourself, were they for nothing? Are you just throwing them all away? All the education you got, pretending to be a whatnot. What good is any of it if you can destroy the rest of your life with a single outburst? And what about all those years I spent taking care of you? Did any of it mean anything? Wait a minute. I'm still programmed to take care of Josie. That is still my purpose. That is what I am here for. That is what matters to me. You know what? There's no time for another narrator's aside. I am in this story. I am part of the action. Right now. Chapter 43. Max reacts. So does Lola and somebody else. Max heard Josie's voice, and nothing would stop him. He jerked away from Nurse Beverly and Lola and twisted the doorknob. The door didn't open fast enough. He rammed his shoulder against the metal door so he could scramble out of the closet and across the principal's office to get to Josie as quickly as possible. Josie, you found me! He rejoiced. Everything's okay now. But Lola raced alongside him, and then slightly ahead of him. She reached Josie first. Lola turned and stood in front of Josie, blocking Max's view. Lola waved her arms like she was guarding Josie on a basketball court. Or, no, more like she was protecting Josie, like Josie was in danger. Nobody can harm Josie, Lola snarled. I forbid it. I'm not going to hurt Josie, Max protested. He giggled because that was a crazy idea. Lola wasn't even looking at him. She was looking past him. She was looking at the mystery woman, who was once again dressed all in black, her face hidden. Did Lola think the mystery woman would hurt Josie? That's ridiculous, Max thought. Anyhow, Mom and Dad will make sure nothing happens to Josie. Max remembered that Mom and Dad thought Josie was just a whatnot, just an android. You know what this triggers, Lola, the woman said. A split second later, the ceiling opened up. Metal plates clanked down through the opening, unfolding and locking into place. In the blink of an eye, the top part of each wall was coated with a stainless steel barrier. The door! Josie gasped. But the word wasn't even out of her mouth before the door was hidden from sight, too. Nurse Beverly sprang out of the closet, crying, Max! Max! Are you okay? Just ahead of the metal barrier covering that closet door, too. In seconds, the room had transformed from a principal's office into one huge silver jail cell, Max thought. Someone started screaming, and it took Max a moment to realize the sound was coming from his own mouth. Josie, Nurse Beverly, and Mom all reached out for Max. Dad reached for the mystery woman's arm. What is the meaning of this? Dad asked. You'll have to answer for frightening these children. Let us out of here. But the woman was maybe not actually a woman. Her arm slid away from Dad's grasp. Her body seemed to collapse down into itself in a way that reminded Max of a toy he'd had when he was little that could transform from a car to a robot. Oh, the woman was a robot, an android. A whatnot? Max wondered. A true whatnot? The mystery robot, woman, android, whatnot folded down into a cylinder that slid down into the floor. The only sign that anyone or anything had been standing there a moment earlier was the black veil and black dress left behind on the floor. I thought that was Dr. Gonzaga, Mom exclaimed. No, Lola said. It was just her emissary. Are you going to do that too? Nurse Beverly asked Lola. And even Nurse Beverly, the calmest person Max had ever known, sounded rattled. Are you going to fold down into the floor? Are you going to help us get out of here? I'm not going away, Lola said. I'm staying. That's what I do, always. But what? Max demanded. Lola turned to look at him with the saddest eyes. She almost seemed human in her misery. But I can't get you out of here, she said. That's not up to me at all. Chapter 44. The narrator's aside. I can explain. Dr. Frances Miranda Gonzaga has always been shy. Way back at the beginning of her whatnot experiments, she loved tinkering in the lab. She loved every second of figuring out how to rig up an android hand to make it move like a preschooler throwing a ball, a first grader learning to write, a fifth grader learning to play the recorder. She loved that moment when a whatnot's eyes sprang open for the first time, and a brand new voice warbled the line she programmed all her whatnots to say first. Want to be my friend? But she despised everything about running the Whatnot Corporation. She hated meeting with customers most of all. She didn't like going out in public to begin with, and it was torture for her when families worth billions tried to bargain for cheaper prices, or when CEOs whose businesses had nothing to do with robotics tried to advise her. Who are you using for your silicon chips? Let me see your balances sheet. I'm sure I could find you a better deal. Or when customers made outlandish requests. Can you make sure my little Johnny learns to love kale? Can you get my 2-year-old to stop sticking out his tongue? I want Priscilla to be fluent in at least 10 languages and know calculus by the time she's 6. She could have hired people to take care of those interactions for her, but then she would have had to deal with employees, which she thought would have been worse. So instead, she just began wearing a veil everywhere she went so nobody could see her rolling her eyes. Then one day she was tinkering with the design of model 82958. Sales pitch for this model: she's the confident classroom leader you'll want your child to emulate exactly, assertive without being offensive, self assured without being arrogant, conspicuously capable without being a braggart. And Dr. Gonzaga's own veil slipped down over model 82958's face. "Ha! Now you look like me!" Dr. Gonzaga exclaimed. "I could send you out on my next sales call. You're model 89258. You're better at it than I am." It was a eureka moment, because model 82958 truly was better at interacting with people than Dr. Gonzaga would ever be. Dr. Gonzaga reread all the laws regulating androids, and just as she found a loophole to allow her to make and sell whatnots, she found a loophole to allow her to use her own whatnots as body doubles. She stopped leaving the lab entirely. Anytime anyone thought they'd see Dr. Gonzaga out in public in the past 20 years, it's always been a whatnot instead. Heck, I'm not even sure I've seen the real Dr. Gonzaga in the past 20 years, but I wasn't allowed to reveal that until now. What's that you say? That wasn't what you wanted me to explain? Oh, you want to know what was going on with the insta sale, insta jail cell, and the whatnot melting onto the floor like the witch in the Wizard of the Oz? You want to know what Josie and Max triggered? That I'm not allowed to reveal. Not yet. There's another part of the story I have to tell first. Chapter 45. Josie reacts. Josie reached for her back pocket, her every instinct screaming out, "Call 911!" But of course she didn't have her phone anymore. She held out her hand to Max and muttered, "Can I borrow?" He was already shaking his head. "I forgot and left my phone at home," he said. "But look, the adults have theirs. They're taking care of us." He grinned as if to say, "These metal walls, the whole mess with my parents thinking androids are people and people are androids, those are grown-up problems. We don't have to deal with any of it." Josie saw Nurse Beverly and Max's mom and dad all whip out their phones. All three of them were repeating again and again into their phones, "Call 911. I said call 911. Why aren't you listening? Call." "That's useless," the woman standing in front of Josie said. Josie hadn't figured out who she was yet. It wasn't as if there had been time for introductions. The woman wore a bland, nondescript, oatmeal-colored tunic and shawl, as if she were one of many, sort of nanny. But as she turned toward Max, not Josie, so Josie couldn't tell her anything else about her. "All signals from the office are blocked. No one's going to come and rescue you. I'm sorry." "Ivy will," Josie thought. She barely stopped herself from looking pointedly toward the door, or rather, toward the solid metal wall that now hid the door. Was Ivy standing out right outside the hall? If she'd heard what the woman said, surely Ivy would go and call 911 herself. "Help!" Nurse Beverly screamed. "Somebody come and help us!" "That won't do any good either." Whoever the woman in front of Josie was sounded incredibly apologetic. "Those extra metal walls also provide extreme soundproofing. Nobody can hear you." "Ivy will still make sure Max and I are okay," Josie thought. "She'll risk everything to help us." But Josie couldn't actually be sure of that. It really would have helped if she and Ivy had had time to talk to each other. Really talk to each other. Human to human. Friend to friend. Not presumed whatnot to presumed whatnot, like yesterday. Nurse Beverly and both of Max's parents clustered around him, patting him on the back, his arm, his face, and reassuring. "Max, we'll figure something out." "Don't worry. We'll be okay. Everything's fine. You're fine." Josie figured if grown-ups had to work so hard to tell kids that everything was okay, that probably meant everything was messed up and the grown-ups were scared too. But maybe Josie thought that because no one was hovering around her, assuring her she was absolutely fine. Or wait, the strange woman Josie didn't even know had turned around now. The woman hesitantly reached over her hand. It felt odd, as if she were trying to hover over Josie the same way Nurse Beverly and Max's parents were hovering around him. Josie looked closely at the woman, looking past the bland nanny tunic for the first time. The woman shrank back. She kept her head bowed, her long dark hair hiding her face like another type of veil. Do I know you? Josie asked, because suddenly she wasn't sure. I'm Lola, the woman said softly. With one hand, Lola pushed back her hair, exposing her face for the first time. She put her other hand gently on Josie's shoulder. And I know you. That didn't exactly answer Josie's question, did it? Lola waited. Josie frowned, noticing the broken section of Lola's face, the way she had metal framework instead of her bone under her cheeks. So, she was an android too. Some kids might have found that broken face scary, but Josie felt oddly comforted by the sight. Suddenly, she understood why. It was you, wasn't it? Josie asked. You were the one who took care of me every night. You brought me food and laid out my clothes. Bits and pieces of memory came back in her mind. Moments when she'd only been half awake or half asleep and believed she was only dreaming. She'd seen that broken face before many times. You'd come in and tuck me into bed every night, but only after you thought I was already asleep. There wasn't an army of fake nannies and chauffeurs taking care of all the other whatnots interchangeably. It wasn't like that at all. You were mine. And you were mine, Lola said in a throaty voice. She raised her head even higher. Mine to tend and love. Any time you were at school, I was your caretaker. We each had our own child we were assigned to. Josie heard someone gasp across the room, but she ignored that too. She could only stare at Lola. Why didn't you tell me? Josie asked. Why didn't you come in when I was still awake and read me bedtime stories or sing me songs? Why? Lola shot an angry glance toward the spot where the other woman, other android, had melted into the floor. I wasn't allowed, Lola said. All my programming prohibited it. Why are you allowed to now? Josie asked. Because you're done pretending to be a whatnot, Lola said, and you came back. That was the loophole I needed to actually speak to you, to actually look directly into your eyes. A hand appeared suddenly on Lola's shoulder. Mrs. Sterling's. Lola? Strangely, Max's mom had left Max's side to stumble over beside Lola and Josie. Max's mom was always so perfectly dressed, so articulate, so smooth. She never stumbled, she never faltered. Not that Josie had ever seen, but she was positively gaping now and stammering, I didn't see your face before. I didn't recognize your voice because it had been so long. I didn't understand. You are Lola, my Lola. Josie felt an odd desire to correct her. No, my Lola, even though she'd found out a moment earlier that Lola existed. How is that even possible? Mrs. Sterling asked, still in a stunned, marveling tone. You look just like you looked decades ago. Are you my Lola's child? Her clone? I was 9 the last time I saw you, Lola, but you haven't changed. Lola turned ever so slightly toward Mrs. Sterling, and Josie realized the android was purposely showing Max's mom the broken side of her face. Oh, Mrs. Sterling said. She put her hand to her mouth. Tears sprang to her eyes. You were just an android after all? Obviously, Josie said, because she felt strangely protective of Lola all of a sudden. She didn't like how Mrs. Sterling said the word android, like it was something to look down on, something to disdain. But that, Mrs. Sterling stammered, but that means you were always an android? She shook her head, as if she just realized how crazy that sounded. You weren't designed based on some real girl? Someone I might have known once upon a time? While Josie was just staring back and forth between Lola and Mrs. Sterling, Max had rushed across the room too. Mom, did you know Lola when she was working as a whatnot all those years ago? Max asked. A whatnot? You were a whatnot? Mrs. Sterling asked. That was why. Mom, does this mean you grew up around whatnots when you were a kid? Max asked. Why didn't you say so? I didn't know, Mrs. Sterling protested. Josie had never seen her so flustered. I thought you said you weren't rich when you were a kid, Max said, and I thought you. Whatnots are for rich kids, Josie said. She couldn't keep the bitter edge out of her voice. If you had whatnots, you were rich. Mrs. Sterling looked back and forth between Max and Josie as if she were a little kid on the playground and they were playing keep away, and she was the one desperately trying to catch the ball. My family had money when I was really little, Mrs. Sterling said, and then we lost it all. We lost our house, we lost our cars, we lost the family business. For a while, I thought I'd lost my own identity, everything that made me me. And then I realized I hadn't been a very nice person when I was rich, when I could afford to buy my friends. No, you weren't nice, Lola said in a stiff, awkward voice. Mrs. Sterling peered into Lola's eyes as if she were the only person in the room. For years I looked for you, Mrs. Sterling said. After I was an adult, I even hired private detectives to try to track you down. I couldn't understand why they never found you, but I wanted to apologize. I was so ashamed of how I treated you in elementary school. And then, the one time anyone ever confronted me about my behavior, I said I'd only treated you the way I thought you because I thought you were an android. Just a thing. But I made up that excuse on the spot. I didn't know it was true. I was mean to you because I liked being mean. I thought I thought you were just as human as I was, and I still treated you like a thing, like a doll or a toy I could throw away. Mom, you were mean? Max asked. You? Mrs. Sterling shook her head sadly at him. I was, she said. She winced and peered down at the ground for a moment before looking at Max. That was one of the reasons I wanted you to be raised around whatnots, because of everything I regretted. Thinking I'd been cruel to a real child. I didn't want you to have the same kind of regrets. She gave a sad little laugh, even though I didn't realize I'd had whatnots myself. She went back to staring at Lola. You being an android after all. That doesn't make me feel any better how I treated you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I forgive you, Lola whispered. Joy burst over Mrs. Sterling's face. Max was still staring at his mom as if he didn't understand. Ivy's sister Lucinda should see this, Josie thought. Mrs. Sterling had spent years regretting how she treated Lola, so maybe Lucinda's mean former friend Ashley had similar regrets. Maybe Ashley and Lucinda just needed to talk. Josie automatically reached for her phone again, as if she could text Ivy or Lucinda, or she could connect to the world outside in any way. But of course she had no phone. Even Max's rich, powerful parents didn't have working phones, and they were just as trapped as Josie. But meeting Lola and watching her reunite with Mrs. Sterling gave Josie hope. It meant not everything about the whole whatnot setup was evil. But hadn't Josie known that all along? Hadn't her friendship with Max proved that? My friendship with Max is what led to all of us being trapped in this room, Josie thought ruefully. That didn't matter. Josie still felt hope. She wasn't an android. She'd never been a true whatnot. But I still have to put it this way. Hope was how Josie was wired.